Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's virtual speaker series with Dr. Monica Turner, our 2021 Benjamin Franklin Medalist in Earth and Environmental Science. She is this year's laureate in this most important field, and we are so excited to welcome her this evening. We are just 1 week out from the Franklin Institute Awards virtual ceremony, our largest and most celebrated event of the year, and it is with great anticipation that I look forward to honoring 11 of the greatest minds in science, engineering, and business. We want to acknowledge the wonderful support of the award ceremony's presenting sponsor, Bank of America. Visit our website, fi.edu, to learn more about how you can join this celebration next Thursday night, April 29th. It will be fantastic. It'll be informative, and it'll be a celebration of the greatest minds in science. Tonight, though, we're going to turn our attention to some pressing issues with Dr. Turner. And leading tonight's program is the Institute's own environmental scientist, Dr. Rachel Valletta. Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks very much, Larry. Thank you, everyone at home, for joining us this evening. I'm certainly grateful for your consistent engagement with us and with all of us here at the TFI family, even after many of these long months of being together separately. But of course, this style gathering does have its benefits, and it means that we can reach Dr. Turner tonight right from the comfort of our own homes. So sit back and relax. Remember, you can submit questions anytime throughout the evening using our Q&A feature, or you can leave comments for everyone to see using the chat box. Dr. Turner, it's an honor to host you this evening. A very, very warm welcome to you, and congratulations on this richly deserved award.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's delightful to be here. Thanks for having me, and I'm welcome to all the folks at home.
Fabulous. We've spoken, the last time we spoke, I mentioned this. I am absolutely in awe of all of our award recipients this year, as always. But I do feel particularly honored to speak with you on this day, of course, the most auspicious of days, Earth Day. And I feel that the earth and environmental sciences are uniquely accessible to everyone in our audience. We all inhabit Earth and we share this space with one another. And I know that's a sense of connection often at the heart of what drives our colleagues in this field. So with that in mind, can you share your own story about how you first entered into the earth and environmental sciences?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I grew up on Long Island, New York. So I was basically a city kid, and I went to college at Fordham University in the Bronx. But I was interested at the time in biology, in either veterinary medicine or being a forest ranger, because I camped in national parks with my family. And when I was 19 years old, I got a position with the Student Conservation Association, and I worked as a ranger naturalist in Yellowstone National Park. And it was just amazing. I had never been west. I had never seen snow-covered mountains or anything of that nature. And after that, I decided I just couldn't be in a clinical setting, that I really wanted to do ecology. And I wasn't exactly encouraged by it to do so at school, because it was such a pre-med dominated program, but I was pretty set on it. So I ended up doing my graduate work in ecology, continued to work with the National Park Service quite a bit in Virgin Islands and in Washington, DC office actually, and then on Cumberland Island National Seashore, which is where I did my PhD. Never expected to go to Yellowstone again as a researcher, but I had just absolutely fallen in love with the place.
And of course, this evening's theme, of course, is studying wildfires. And that's just one facet of the Yellowstone environment that you've explored there. So take us back to the late 80s. Some of the work that you've done was born from a major wildfire in Yellowstone itself in 1988. Take us back to that field season and tell us a little bit about that particular megafire.
Sure. So I was at the time working in the very new field of landscape ecology. So trying to understand what the patterns of habitats are in the landscape, what causes them. And for anybody who's listening, if when you're flying and you look down out of the airplane window and you look down, you can see all the diversity of habitats and things like that. So we were interested in that. And disturbances like fire are one of the processes that create pattern in the landscape. So I had been working on theoretical models of how disturbances would spread and what kinds of patterns they would create. And I was looking for a real system in which to test those ideas. Yellowstone was one of the few places where the person who became my long-term collaborator, Bill Rami, had mapped the fire history in Yellowstone, and that wasn't the type of data that was available for many places. So we made a plan to link his fire history work with my modeling work on the computer, and we agreed to meet out in Yellowstone for a week or 10 days in the summer of 1988. So we were out there in July of that summer, and lo and behold, there were these big fires burning, and I have pictures of seeing them burning across the other side of the lake, but multiple lakes there. And of course, they ended up occupying or affecting a third of Yellowstone, and they were on the news every single night for that summer. And it was really the first of the big fire events in the West throughout the 20th century or the modern times that kind of ushered in this new era of activity. So the funny thing is that we never did the project that we were planning to do for meeting out there, but we ended up being directed in completely new ways.
Right, some of us may be familiar with that 1988 fire. If any of us have visited the park, of course, there's still evidence of it and lots of signage and whatnot to help us understand just how widespread that was. We do have some photos from the field that you've shared with me, and I'd like to come back to those in just a few minutes, because what I'd like to do, Monica, is think about the 1988 Yellowstone megafire compared to more recent megafires. For example, last year, 2020, one of the most extreme wildfire seasons we have on record. Of course, we have some understanding of what's driving that, which we can unpack in just a moment, but help us understand and put into context that 2020 wildfire season. Is it comparable at all to this 1988 fire? Is it much worse? Is it much more widespread? How can we think about that?
So it is comparable in that it burned during the dry, hot conditions that also characterized Yellowstone in 1988. Yellowstone had the driest, like the droughtiest summer still in the instrumental record that summer since the late 1800s. So the fires we saw in 2020 were extreme. I mean, in the United States, they burned over 13 million acres. California saw its largest fire season in modern history. The biggest fires in Colorado happened in 2020. Oregon and Washington also saw enormous fires, and they were very high severity. And they had just terrible tragedies for people. I mean, homes burning, people's lives lost, people living in smoke for the whole summer. Now, were they completely unprecedented? Not from the standpoint of the fires happen when we have weather conditions like that. And even in the Cascades, so in the Oregon, Washington area, in the old forests that burn, that are sort of the wetter forest types, they have burned at intervals of 100 to 500 years throughout the last 10,000. So that's the Holocene. So from when the glaciers left until now, that's sort of how far back our records go. And in Yellowstone also, large severe fires have happened at 100 to 300 year intervals. So they're not completely unprecedented. High severity fires do happen in places that are prone to burn. What's different now is that climate change is acting kind of as a threat multiplier. So it's making the conditions that give us the big wildfire years happen more often and for a longer time period and synchronized perhaps over a larger area.
So you mentioned that we can look to evidence that suggests that megafire wasn't unprecedented. What types of evidence do we actually find in the field for previous burns?
In the field, there's two things that people really focus on, and this is not what I specifically do, but it's the dendrochronology. So tree rings is the easier way to say it, where you can look for fire scars on trees and then reconstruct the years and the sizes of the fires in the past. And that can take you back to the age of the oldest tree. So, hundreds of years. And then the paleoecologists who can take cores out of the bases, the bottoms of lakes, and they can date the sediment and they can identify the time periods when charcoal has come in. So those are the samples that allow us to go back over the 10,000 year window of time. So those are two really important sources of information, and they're crucial for putting into context what we see happening today. And in fact, I mentioned Bill Rami, his fire history work that he had done mapping the spatial patterns of fires and when they burned in Yellowstone. At the time, that did not have an applied dimension to it. It was what we would call blue sky science. I mean, he was interested in questions about how landscapes change. And lo and behold, when the 1988 fires came around, that information was crucial to understanding the 88 fires, because we knew that big fires had occurred in the 1800s and in the 1700s in different places.
All right, so helping us, of course, put into the larger geological context there. Geochronology, a field close to my heart as well, something I had a chance to study. We've got a few questions in the Q&A, Monica. I'd like to visit some of these.
Okay.
One attendee asks, is it possible for wildfires to occur in wetlands?
Yes, it is. And in fact, that is happening in some of the northern areas up in Canada and up in Siberia and places like that. And actually in the southeastern United States, places like the Okefenokee Swamp can burn when they dry out. And in all of these wetlands, there's a buildup of peat. And so the fires can actually keep going from one year to the next because they can sometimes continue underground. So up in the far north, the burning of the wetlands is actually a pretty serious issue because permafrost is melting, areas are drying out, and there is so much carbon stored in those wetlands that we are releasing a lot to the atmosphere when they burn, as opposed to having stored it away and kind of kept it in a lockbox for a very long time. So yes, wetlands can indeed burn.
Yes. So of course, Monica, referring there to the amount of carbon stored in permafrost, some estimates, as I understand, suggest that there's upwards of double the amount of carbon dioxide stored in permafrost as there is in the atmospheric amount, which is pretty extraordinary when we think about that. And one of these tipping points, these climate tipping points that we're really, really worried about, and of course, forest ecologists like yourself are keeping an eye on very, very closely. We have another few questions here coming about how fires are set. So how can you tell the difference between natural forest fires and fires set by arsonists?
Oh, so I am not a forensic fire scientist, but the human-caused fires are common in certain portions of the country, and then there are other places where lightning ignitions are common. I can't speak to arson. I think most of the fires that are human caused are accidental. So people leave an unattended campfire, or they throw still cigarettes out the window, or there's winds and power lines come down, or there's a spark from equipment. So I think that's more so. I can't speak to how they figure out the arson side, just because I haven't done it. In the northern Rocky Mountains and in the far northern areas of the forest, so in the areas where I work, it's mostly lightning. It's natural sources of ignition for the most part. The southeastern United States has more human-caused ignitions, and so do some portions of California. So it varies regionally.
Yes, and a statistic you and I recently discussed was, what percentage was it that the wildfires that most encroach upon where humans live overwhelmingly are those set by other humans? Is that right?
Oftentimes that is the case, but not always. So even last year, the fires in Oregon and Washington mostly resulted from a set of severe thunderstorms that came through the region. And so there were a lot of fires started by lightning all at the same time. And they did burn then into development. So I think it can still be a mix.
Sure.
There's a colleague, Jennifer Balch at the University of Colorado in Boulder, who has done a lot of work on the sources of ignition.
Yes. But of course, those 2020 fires, as mentioned, the stage was set because it was so dry. So let's turn our lens now towards the future, towards 2021. Coming into the summer, we know from NOAA that it's drought conditions still in much of the Midwest and West Coast regions. Do we have a feel for if we can expect another fairly intense wildfire season just like 2020?
I can't say if it'll be just like 2020, but because the temperatures continue to warm and the drought conditions are persisting, and we're also seeing more intensive droughts in a lot of these places as well, it changes three critical things about the fire season. So the snow melts out earlier. So that means things can dry out and be primed for fire sooner than they used to be. The summers are hotter and drier, so the drought conditions can be more intense, and fuels that are dry are what burns. And I should also remind people, it's not just the dead fuels. This is something we always think about, because when you build a campfire or you build a fire in your fireplace, you put dead logs in, you don't put live branches in. But in forest fires that are burning through pines and spruces, all the conifers, the needles are highly flammable. So that is fuel as well, but they dry out too. But then putting this all together, the fire seasons are longer. So there's a longer time for the fires to keep on going. So as the climate is continuing to warm and droughts are being persistent, yes, there are projections from the National Interagency Fire Center that they go out 3 months. So I've looked at it recently, and they go out through July for this year, suggesting that fire risk will be high throughout the Southwest and much of the central, like the western portion of the plains. So yeah, I think that we still don't know where and when exactly fires will happen, but the conditions will be right. And as we look further, if we continue pushing the climate this way, we'll just have those conditions available more often.
So we know again, unfortunately, that the stage may be set for some widespread wildfires, but we can't quite put a finger on it. So is it the case that they're so darn difficult to predict because we're not quite sure what that source of ignition is, or are there other complicating factors?
Yep, we don't know when and where they're going to be ignited. So that's, we don't know when a thunderstorm is going to come through, or when an accidental start may happen and where that will be. And the other wild card that really comes into play a lot is wind, because the fires that get really big and just move rapidly across the landscape they're propelled by the winds. And so that's another similarity between the recent 2020 fires. The winds were in California, I forget the name of which fire, but the wind was blowing burning embers, and an ember is not just a spark, it could be a whole tree branch, was burning them, blowing them over rivers. And that's exactly the kind of behavior we saw in the 1988 fires, because rivers and roads, and even for any of you who have been to Yellowstone and seen the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, the fires were able to spot or spread across the canyon. And so whether or not the winds blow up like that, and the direction that they blow and how that comes into play is also a big deal. So that's why the fire danger rating system has the red flag warning. So people are now hearing that in the news a lot, and that means the conditions are dangerous, where fires could start and then really take off. And then you can't really control them under those circumstances, and it's not safe to put people in harm's way either.
Of course. So alluding again there, Monica, to Yellowstone Park. So now's a good time. You've shared some wonderful field photos with me, and I'm excited to share with our audience tonight, because for those of us that haven't had a chance to visit these landscapes, this is what it looks like on the ground. And so I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen, and Monica, you can navigate me through these as you're ready.
Thank you, Rachel. Perfect. So these are pictures. I did not take these pictures. These are Park Service photos, but I was there on July 23rd that year, and then in September. So these are photos of the forest fires as they were burning through the forests in Yellowstone during the summer of 1988. So many of you might have seen some of this on the news if you remember it. So if you go to the next slide, please, Rachel. At the end, I sometimes like to say that these are color photos. They're not black and white, but you can't really see any green in them. And so this is what so much of the forest looked like during, at the end of the summer. So after the fires had burned through. And these, I walked through these areas, and at the time we really thought that everything was just killed. We as scientists had not seen recent fires of this kind in recent times. So next, please. So this is just a map. The outline of Yellowstone Park is shown in the dashed lines, and then the red there is marks the perimeters of the area of the fires that burned in 1988. So you can see how much of Yellowstone National Park they affected. That's Yellowstone Lake in the middle. And for those of you who have been there, the black are the Grand Loop, so the roads that you would have driven around to visit everything. So next, please. So I, however, got to go up in a helicopter. So this is a picture of me in front of the helicopter in the fall of 1988, because we wanted to see what that landscape looked like, because we walked around in it like the places that I showed you. And what was surprising on the next slide, if you could go to the next one, please, Rachel. There, that is one of the pictures that I took from the helicopter looking down on those red areas within the park. So despite the fact that it looked like everything was devastated when you went driving along in the road, what we found was that it was really a complex spatial mosaic that almost looks like a quilt, a little bit of a random pattern quilt, but like quilt pattern. And so the areas that are really dark black are places where the trees were completely consumed and the needles were consumed. The areas that are green are islands that are not burned, and those are really important for seed sources and for animals and things like that. And then the brown areas are places that fringe, all those black areas where the trees were killed, but the foliage wasn't all consumed. So this type of heterogeneity or diversity is also very similar to what we see even in the big fires that you're hearing about recently. They don't create moonscapes, sections of it maybe, but not the whole thing. So next, please. So one of the things that we found that we were actually pretty surprised about was just how fast the forests recovered. So in the upper left is kind of what it looked like when I was walking around in the fall of 1988. And then you can see my little Swiss Army knife, and depending on how big your screen is at home, there's a little baby pine tree seedling there. And the tree seedlings were just everywhere, but they're tiny. They're only about an inch tall. So you got to get down on your hands and knees in some places to find them. And then the wildflowers and the grasses, many of them survived because the fires didn't burn very deeply into the soil. And so the middle picture where you can see the yellow and pink flowers, these are all plants that survived the fire. They grew back, and then in the second year after the fires, they just flowered. So if any of you are out in burned forest 2 years after fire, you'll see a profusion of wildflowers. And they provided the seeds that allowed the native plants to seed back in. And then the bottom right picture is showing the size of the trees. They're only about maybe 4 feet tall in that picture, about 15 years later, showing you just how many of the trees came back in. So we went from that blackened landscape to all these beautiful wildflowers to a lot of trees. Next, please. And one of the reasons that we have so many trees is that one of the dominant tree species in Yellowstone is lodgepole pine. And many of the lodgepole pines create what we call a canopy seed bank. So if you think of a bank as the place you store your money and you put money all the time, and then you build up your savings account, the trees are kind of doing this with their seeds. So they produce these cones that you see in the middle that are grayish, and they produce them each year, and they start building up as the tree gets older. And the cones stay closed until they're heated, which is what happens when the fires occur. The heat breaks the resin bonds that seal the cone, and then the cones shed their seeds onto the forest floor, which is perfect for them to germinate because they like the exposed soil. They don't want the competition from other plants. They like the sunlight and all of that. So it's the perfect conditions for them. And so they come in right away, like the year after the fire, and then that sets the stage for the forest to recover. So it's one of the key adaptations to fires, even if they're severe. Next one, please. So if you're out there now, this is a few years ago, but they look very similar. I took this picture 25 years later. So this is July 2013. And if you have been there, this is looking over the Madison River. So between West Yellowstone and Madison Junction, if you know the area. And that sea of green is all lodgepole pine trees. And I think many visitors don't even see the evidence of the fires anymore because they just see a lot of young forests. The tall trees that are sticking up are ones that survived from 1988. So one more slide here, Rachel, and then, So this illustration I worked on with staff at National Geographic, and it sort of shows that sequence that I just showed you from a burned forest to a recovered forest. And I would say the key thing that we learned from the 1988 fires was just how resilient and how able to recover these systems were, even though what it looked like the forests had been devastated, really weren't. They were very able to adapt and recover.
Fabulous. Thanks, Monica. I think that those are really, really powerful photos. And when you say forest resilience there, that's essentially, as I take it, the narrative that you're referring to, this natural process of burning and repopulating. Got a lot of questions in the Q&A here, so I'd like to address those.
Sure.
Many of us, of course, are talking about forest prevention, which I think, forest fire prevention, excuse me, which I think I'd like to come back to in just a little bit. So let's put a pin in that one now. There's a lot of questions here about wildfire ignition. These two are somewhat paired. How common are wildfires caused by lightning? And a paired question, what's the most common cause of wildfires?
So the answer still depends on where you are. So in the Yellowstone region, I'll speak to that. And then also this would hold for, as you went up the spine of the Rocky Mountains into Canada as well, and up through Alaska. So the higher elevation areas, the most common cause is lightning. That accounts for most of them. In some of the dry forested areas, and so the southeastern United States and even in California, there is a greater source of human ignition. And I mentioned work by another scientist, Jennifer Balch. She has detected a strong peak of human ignitions on the 4th of July in the data that's in the United States.
Yes, we can all imagine there. Another question here that I'd like to home in on, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, Monica, because I believe it's referring to this photo here, which is an absolutely striking aerial photo. And it really speaks to, as you mentioned, this patchwork quilt. The question is asking, are similar patterns emerging between different fires? So do we see this elsewhere as well?
Yes, we do. And it's kind of interesting because when I took this photo and my colleague and I were up in the helicopter, this was a surprise. People just didn't know that this happened, that it was this heterogeneous. But it's pretty much the case in any of the wildfires that you read about. They don't burn everything. The wind blows in different directions, or maybe there's a ravine or something that just sort of is randomly affecting oftentimes where the fire goes. And so there are always these islands of unburned areas that persist through. And for certain tree species, that's really important. So if you're not a serotinous lodgepole pine, like what I just showed you, but you're a spruce or a fir that doesn't have that adaptation for the cones and you're killed by the fire, then you need live trees nearby as a seed source to reestablish. And so these can be super important locations for the recovery of the forests. So one of the issues that we've been still grappling with, and that myself and other colleagues are studying, is whether or not the fires are getting so much larger in size. So not the total area burned, but rather the sizes of these black patches like you see in the middle, and whether we're starting to see areas that are so big that they exceed the ability of seeds to disperse in. And that is starting to happen in some places. But the patchwork is still consistent. We're still seeing it in fires that are recent.
And you touched on another question that's come through our Q&A here, asking if climate change is to blame here. So is climate change accelerating the frequency with wildfires, or of wildfires, excuse me, to the point that forests don't have time to recover? And it sounds perhaps exactly that might be the case in some areas.
In some areas that is, and that's very much the focus of our current research, because there's several different ways that can happen. One is, so I mentioned that the weather conditions are just more conducive for fire. And so in the Yellowstone area, it used to be only like every 100 or 300 years, depending on where we were in the past 10,000, that the conditions were that hot and dry, but we're seeing that happening more often. So that means that it's possible for some of the young forests to reburn. And we saw that happen in 2016 in Yellowstone, where the young forests were burning, and some were only 16 years old, some were only 28 years old. They didn't have cones yet. So if the fires occur before the forest has a chance to recover so that it has a source of seed, then you lose your seed source. And that's just one dimension of it. I mentioned that the size of the fires is getting larger. And so we're seeing evidence in some places that that's happening. We're also seeing evidence in some places that with young forests burning, and actually I have some slides I can show for that, we're actually consuming so much more of the biomass than we would have seen. So the climate change is affecting those dimensions of the fire cycle that affect the forests. And then the other component that is really an important one as well is when the tree seedlings get established, they're kind of like the baby seedlings in your garden. So you have to really baby them, you know, in the beginning, because if you don't water them for a couple of days, they might die. And so our tree seedlings are very much the same thing. So we're also concerned about what kinds of weather conditions are occurring during the year after, or the first few years after, when the seedlings are really vulnerable. So yeah, there's a lot of ways that climate is accelerating and accelerating the fire cycle and possibly eroding the resilience of those forests.
And you picked up on the term erosion there. I think a surprising thing we don't think about when we're needing to baby those wee seedlings in a recently burned forested region, well, formerly forested region, suddenly heavy rain events can become very, very erosive and extremely detrimental to those potential seedlings. We don't often think about that as a threat in a wildfire regime.
That's true. But what we're seeing, I think, more often is that it gets too dry and they just shrivel up. And so we've done some experiments where one of my former PhD students, Winslow Hansen, and also current PhD student, Tyler Hecker, have both done experiments where we've planted the seeds, you know, either in one case where the climate today matches the climate we expect in Yellowstone's forests in mid-century, and many of the seedlings did not survive there, or in areas where these fires reburned the young forest and there was nothing left to provide, like there weren't even dead trees to provide some shade. And there we also saw that the soil temperatures got really hot, like several degrees hotter than a nearby burned forest that still had the standing trees providing some shade. So yeah, kind of a double whammy, triple whammy.
Sure. Here's another question about forest replanting. One audience member asks, do you ever replant trees or do you just let them grow back naturally?
So that depends on where you are. So in places that are national parks, like in Yellowstone or in designated wilderness areas in the United States, we don't replant. We let the natural processes happen. And that's been really important because we've learned a lot and sometimes we don't really know exactly what we should do. And there are cases where people have seeded in maybe the wrong species and then they take over. However, if you're on managed forests or private forests or maybe commercial areas where you're growing the trees for timber, then yes, replanting does happen in some cases. And one of the things that is being considered and discussed quite a bit now is, as we anticipate the changes in climate, again, not in the wilderness and not in the national parks, but in other areas that we manage, should we and can we maybe assist trees to get there and plant the species that is adapted for the expected climate? And that's a really important topic in both the science and the management side of the community, because with the rate of change that the climate is going may be too fast for the species to keep up with their ability to migrate with, you know, dispersing seeds, and then you got to grow and you got to grow older and trees take a long time to grow. So we're looking at rates of change that we haven't seen previously. So it's possible that we'll be doing some replanting in some areas with species maybe that currently are further south in latitude, but might be the things that can grow in areas in the future.
Still on mute there. Absolutely. Here's a fascinating and related question, Monica, in our Q&A. Is your research and the work of others in the field influencing how forest management agencies are doing their work? And how does the patchwork quilt phenomenon influence forest management?
So yes, our work is influencing forest management in the region. And one of the things that we've tried to work hard at is to really communicate a lot and as partners, so to speak, with the fire ecologists and the forest managers of our Western national forests and national parks. So actually just, gosh, about 3 weeks before COVID shut everything down in the country, we had workshops with the managers in the Yellowstone region and then also further to the west in Montana around Missoula, just to make it easier for people that didn't have to travel so far, to go over our findings and ask for insight into interpretation and have just really good discussions with the forest managers. And it's been very valuable because we learn a lot from them because they're on the ground and they're trying to manage a resource. And they learn a lot from us because they aren't necessarily even having access to the current state of the science. So it is an influence. It's hard to kind of assess and put your finger on it, but a lot of times we're providing the science background and the science justification for what they're trying to do. And I think that, segueing to the patchwork quilt, I think that's also a good question for that topic, because one of the management recommendations that I would like to see practiced much more is when fires are being managed and put out, not to do what's called a burnout, where you go back in and get rid of all the remaining potential fuel in the hopes that the fire can't start again. And that has been done in the past in some places, and yet maintaining that diversity and maintaining that patchwork is going to be really critical. So that's a case where that's, from the people that I speak to, they don't do that so much. We also have them come out with us in the field in the summer. So, the fire managers and fire ecologists in Grand Teton and in Yellowstone come out with us all the time, for a day or two in the field. So it's great communication. And same is true for some of the national forests in the area.
You mentioned there, Monica, the importance of diversity. Why is it so important for our forested landscapes to be rich in diversity?
So it's a variety of different reasons. In terms of the diversity of the forest structures, that's what helps to give you the resilience. So you have old forests and young forests. They provide habitat also for a variety of different species, and different species depend on different stages of that forest development and different compositions. And even the burned forests have their own specialists. So there are woodpeckers that come in and they use those burned trees and they leave holes that are then occupied by mountain bluebirds and things go on. And then there are also species that need the old forests and they only live there. So by maintaining some of all of that, you provide a variety of different habitats for the animal species as well.
So backing out from that question to an even higher 10,000 foot view. So more broadly, how does a landscape ecologist assess the health of a forest ecosystem? Of course, you mentioned some of those biodiversity factors are crucial, but how do you go about doing that as an ecologist?
Yeah, so we actually do pay attention to the distribution of species and the age structure on the landscape and the size structure of the forest. So we, in terms of how we actually do it, I mean, we go out and we measure things. We count trees and we measure their diameters and we test their ages, and we record the diversity of the understory vegetation and such as well. But then we also use remote sensing, so satellite imagery as well. So we do a variety of different things, but we do try to see if we can make sure that the forest recovery processes are maintained. So as long as we see evidence that the forest is recovering, then it seems like it's holding on to its resilience and staying kind of healthy. Healthy is still a little bit of a more of a human term because they change a lot. Because, and even in forest health, sometimes insect outbreaks happen and they do kill trees too, but they don't kill whole forests necessarily. So, but we pay attention to that. So, you know, the reproduction, the mortality, growth rates and the like. The other thing that we pay attention to, so carbon has come up a little bit when we were talking about the wetlands. And we do pay attention to things like the carbon and the nutrient stocks and that cycling, because that's also really important. So the trees and the plants need the nitrogen to continue to thrive, and the balance of carbon and the rate at which carbon is recovered following fires is another thing that we pay attention to. In Yellowstone, it takes about 100 years for a forest to recover all of the carbon that is lost during a fire. So as long as you don't reburn it before 100 years, there's no net loss of carbon from the system.
So alluding there, of course, to the great ability of forested landscapes to store carbon, which brings me to a related question. And we've talked a bit about, of course, climate change driving more enduring droughts and behind perhaps the spread of these megafires. Affecting forested landscapes. But on the flip side, forested landscapes and reforestation can be a key climate action to maintain these carbon sinks, as you just mentioned. In your view, what are the impacts of reforestation on long-term climate change? And do wildfires threaten the potential success of these reforestation efforts?
So in terms of planting of trees, that's a good thing. And so trees do store carbon and that's a good thing. Is it sufficient to counter the greenhouse gas emissions that we're doing? It's not. So I think we need to be careful about not assuming that that will be the magic bullet or silver bullet to solve the problem. In terms of whether forest fires are threatening that, it depends on if we disrupt that recovery cycle. Because again, it's not the immediate loss of carbon that happens, and that happens in any disturbance. You're sending up the fine fuels when they're combusted. Most of the wood is still there. So if you saw my pictures of the burned forest, the big trees are still standing there, and even the big logs that are on the ground, only about 8% of them of that biomass was combusted in the fires. The rest is very slow through decomposition. So so if you have to kind of think of it over that fire cycle, which is why if we start burning before carbon is recovered, whether you reforested by hand or you let it happen naturally, we could start seeing, we kind of refer to it as a ratchet, like a downward set of steps, like a stair step down. And if that happens, then yes, it will threaten the ability of the systems to store carbon. And that's one of the things that we're actually focused on quite a bit currently.
That brings us to many of the questions that have come through in our Q&A here, of course, about solutions. So many attendees have asked us what we can do, not just to battle the wildfires, but how we can prevent them in the future. And I know that this is actually kind of complicated answer here. So let's start perhaps from an individual standpoint first, and then move to a larger collective standpoint. So what can we do individually to help prevent and combat these forest fires?
Yeah. So you're right, Rachel, it is a very complex answer. And so what we can do individually depends a little bit on where we are. So I'm gonna give you two answers there. One, which is a little bit general, to say as individuals, anything that we can do to help restore the atmosphere, that's the ultimate solution. It's a long-term one, but it's critical. So, I mean, we should be doing that and being activists and in our own lives, trying to reduce our carbon footprint. If we live in places that are fire prone and fires are unnaturally happening because not only of climate change, but because of a buildup of fuels. And this is something we haven't touched on that I think is important in my answer, because fire is not the same everywhere. And so I've talked about Yellowstone, which has these infrequent, really severe fires naturally. There's other parts of the United States even. So the Southwest, the dry forests that are ponderosa pine dominated or Douglas fir dominated some of the lower elevation areas in California. These are places that historically burned frequently, maybe every 5 to 10 years, but at low severity. So the fire would, instead of burning up into the crowns, it would creep along the surface of the floor. These are places where, because fires have been suppressed since the early 1900s, there are some places where the forest has just switched from being open and it's grown really thick, kind of like Yellowstone normally is. In those places, the trees are adapted to survive the low severity fires. They have really thick bark. So once they get big enough, the fire doesn't kill the big trees, it just kills the little ones and leaves a very open park-like environment. In those places, restoring fire on the landscape is really important. So, and reducing the fuel. So it needs to be targeted, and it can be especially even further targeted around communities or valuable infrastructure, the places that people live, because the other thing is we have so many more people living in areas that are going to burn. That's an issue. So supporting that type of activity is actually really going to help for those kinds of forests. It won't help in a place like Yellowstone because we're going to have to adapt to the fires there. And it may be that we avoid living in some of the places that are at higher risk, just like we avoid now living in floodplains and places that are at risk for storms because fires are an event like that. So I'm sorry, I kind of digressed into the differences in fire because there isn't a one size fits all answer for that. The other thing is if you're in places that are likely to burn, building with materials that will survive fire is really important. So there's a program in the United States called FireWise that will help homeowners know how they can reduce the fuels around their properties and use materials that won't burn. And that's also going to be really important in places where it's not a matter of if they will burn, it's a matter of when. So there are things that individuals can very much do to reduce their risk.
Now, in that answer, Monica, you referenced, of course, management practices that have perhaps helped or hindered fire outbreak in the past. And this is a topic that has become politically contentious, unfortunately. But do we have a sense, and many of the questions coming through in our Q&A are sort of getting towards this point, do we have a sense of what the balance is in terms of causing wildfires? I mean, is it really to blame management practices, or is it really to blame lightning strikes? Do we have a sense of what that balance looks like? Or is this just sort of a Trojan horse of a question?
So no, we actually do have a balance. It just depends geographically on the forest type and where you are. So in the southwestern United States and in the Sierra Nevada, the drier forests in California, there is a combination of past fire fire suppression, I should say, that allowed unnatural fuels to build up. This is true for some of the forests in Arizona and New Mexico as well. It's not everywhere, but these are places where the fuels really have grown up, and there is an effect of fire suppression. And then the drying climate, however, it's not even so much the change in lightning. I don't think we're seeing big trends in that, although there was the extensive storms, but it's the drier climate conditions that are then interacting with those. So there are portions of the West, particularly, again, those dry forest types, where both factors are at play. And those are the areas where we really have to manage the fuels. In the cooler, wetter forest types, there isn't much of an effect of past fire suppression. So they didn't have a role in the 1988 fires. And in fact, fuels, they affect the fire behavior a bit, but the wind-driven fires are pretty, they ignore variations in fuel. I mean, whether it's sparse or dense or anything, I mean, they'll burn all of it. It's quite vulnerable. And like I said, they'll burn across fire breaks. So in those places, it's the weather conditions and the lightning ignitions that are dominant.
And we have another question in our chat here, which I think pairs well there. Are controlled burnings a possible solution to reduce wildfires? And I would suspect from your answer, it may be yes, and depending on where we are.
Yes, it depends on where we are. So controlled fires, or we also call them prescribed fires, both terms are used, are one of the things that's very effective in those dry forest types. And so you can thin out all of that extra, like the small trees that have grown in that are not normally there under the historical conditions. And yes, so that's, there are many places where adding more fire to the landscape would be a good thing. Even in the central part of the country, you can restore oak savannas that have grown in by adding more fire. So that's in the areas of Wisconsin. Prescribed or controlled fire does not work in the systems like lodgepole pine because they don't burn under conditions that are suitable for controlled burning. It's not what the tree species are adapted to. And they burn under these infrequent high severity events. And again, all of the biota are perfectly well adapted to that as long as they don't happen too frequently. So you have to be a little bit judicious about where you think of applying it. But there are places in the West where there's definitely a fire deficit because so many had been suppressed.
And another question, Monica, you've been so fabulous here. I know we've got a rapid fire Q&A, so thank you to our fabulous audience. Let's take two more from our Q&A. Are wildfires ever beneficial? For example, with infested forests? And I'm assuming that means perhaps infested with invasive species of some kind.
Oh, so I would say wildfires are often beneficial in the sense that they, in their natural regime to which the trees and the plants and the animals are adapted, they rejuvenate the forest. They allow for the new things to establish. In terms of infestations with non-native species, it depends. So there is one of the really problem species in the Western United States, particularly in the dry areas, is cheatgrass. And so cheatgrass thrives with more fire. It kind of sets this positive feedback going and then it outcompetes everything else. And it's really a problem. So in that case, it does not. In terms of things like native forest pests like bark beetles. So some of you may be familiar with the bark beetle outbreaks that were also throughout the West in about 2000 to 2010, more or less. In those cases, the bark beetles actually, you can think of them as thinning the forest a bit because they kill not all the trees, they kill some of the trees. And then there's an interaction with fire there where fire can come through and not be too changed, but both things are responding also to the warming climate. So I would say it's maybe not beneficial isn't quite the right word, but they're both natural events that are okay and the systems are adapted to them.
Okay, and here's a challenging one, I think. You mentioned earlier that, of course, we've got some areas that are quite densely populated, and we're right up against these drying areas. And so we're putting ourselves perhaps in harm's way a bit. And one attendee asks us, in your experience, does the personal and the economic impact of wildfire help people understand the widespread impacts of climate change and motivate them to take action? So do you think that those folks that are exposed right there to those frequently burning areas, are they more aware? Are they more aggressive on taking action?
So I don't know about the taking action on climate change. They are aware. I mean, many of the people that live in these communities are aware of fire. They are aware of the risk, and in many cases, they're trying to mediate the risk around their houses and their communities. Whether or not they're motivated to address climate change, I don't know. Unfortunately, I'm still very saddened that this issue has become politicized. And so I think people will sometimes recognize that fires happen and hot seasons happen, but they don't necessarily accept the causation or what we need to do about it. So I guess I wish, even especially on Earth Day today, I wish that our science and our understanding and our commitment to the stewardship of our environment was not political, because it doesn't really matter what party we are a part of or anything of that sort. So I don't know. I guess. So you're right. That was a challenging question. And that also gets into the social science arena, which is not my, my wheelhouse.
Sure. Well, Monica, I'd like to round off our discussion tonight with one last question. And it's a little bit of a selfish one that you raised to me when we previously spoke. And you said to me that the natural environment consistently surprises you, or you never cease to be surprised by the natural environment. What has been most surprising, most eye-catching for you in your work studying landscapes all these years? And what's the next surprise you hope to find?
Well, I think that the most surprising thing to me was the resilience that we saw in Yellowstone after the fires, because as you saw from my pictures, I mean, even as scientists, we thought that the fires were devastating. And so the resilience that we saw went counter in some cases to expectations or to conventional wisdom, even in terms of some of the tree species like aspens that came in by seed throughout the burned forest, and that wasn't supposed to happen. Like, we were always taught that they hadn't reproduced by seed since the ice ages. So those mechanisms were really surprising. And I think for me, it's also underscored the value of our national parks and wildernesses as living laboratories and as national scientific treasures, as well as places that preserve our, the unique aspects of our environment and our cultural heritage and our landscapes as well. So I guess what I would hope is that we find more evidence of the ability of these natural systems to persist in the face of environmental change, and that we are able also to provide enough stepping stones or connectivity of habitats to help our species persist and adapt to these changes, because they provide so much that we all depend on. So I'm an optimist at heart. I believe we can address our changing climate, and I believe we can still find evidence of the ability of nature to show us some tricks that we might be able to then use in our own management.
A wonderful sentiment to end us on there. Dr. Turner, thank you so much. So looking for more resilience in our natural environment and providing the stepping stones where we can. A wonderful sentiment to end us here on Earth Day. So I will say thank you so very much to you, Dr. Turner, for joining us tonight. And thank you to our fabulous audience. We had quite a rapid fire question and answer and a fabulous discussion. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. Remember to check out our programming 1 week from tonight. You can find coverage of Dr. Turner as well as all of our other laureates receiving their medals with the honor, of course, that they deserve. And I suppose that does it for us. So we'll sign off here. Thank you, everyone. Happy Earth Day. Have a lovely evening.